Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last session of the 2021 Educators Ag Institute. I'm Cassidy. I'll be your host. First, we have a little bit of housekeeping. In the chat box is the pretest. If you have not taken that already, please go ahead and do so. Also, we cannot hear or see you, so your way of communication is through the chat box. If you want things to be seen by everyone, like sharing resources or ideas with other attendees, please make sure your dropdown says all panelists and attendees. There is also a Q&A box for questions, so you can ask our presenters some questions throughout the day. And lastly, just please be respectful as everything is visible to everyone else. Now is also a good time to grab your little box. There's a little thing labeled Pasto Agricultural Museum, and you can go ahead and do that. And I will also share the pretest again. So with that, let's hand it over to Rita.
Hello, Cassidy, and everyone out there. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of today's session and your whole program. We hope sometime soon to have everyone here at the museum, at the Pasto Agricultural Museum, part of Penn State's College of Agricultural Sciences. But for the moment, we'll work with what we've got, and we have some exciting things to share with you today, even though you can't be here in person. And while we're not yet open to the public, but getting ready to be, we are developing some tools and resources for you as teachers and educators that you might be able to tap into to use in your classroom. So you'll get a preview of some of these things that I'll share with you today. I'm going to just start with a brief introduction about the Pasto Agricultural Museum. And I'd like to do it by way of a story, because a lot of what we do here at the museum is tell stories as a way to help people connect their own experience with the science and history that we see in our historic collections at the museum, as well as the work that is surrounding us in the 2,200-acre research farm that our museum site sits in the middle of. We serve as an interpretive site and welcome center for our science researchers and make connections for scientists, students at all levels, practitioners, farmers, teachers, policymakers, and for the general public with programs throughout the year. So let me start by taking a short segue. I'm going to share my screen, and Cassidy, you're going to make sure that it's actually being shared and turn on the slides. All right.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. It's nice when technology is cooperating. So the Pasto Agricultural Museum connects the science and history of agriculture to the present day. Our website is posted here. agsci.psu.edu is part, the website as well as the museum is part of the College of Agricultural Sciences here at Penn State University, and add a /Pasto and you'll find our homepage with some resources. I'm Rita Graef. I'm the collections curator and museum educator here at the Pasto Museum. I also oversee the Armsby Respiration Calorimeter in the heart of our main campus, and that is a historic instrument used in agricultural sciences that was built in 1902. Today we'll focus on the Pasto Museum. And a small story to begin. This is a hat in a box. As a curator, I have sometimes the pleasure of attending auctions and opportunities to find collections to add, objects to add to our collection. And a hat like this came up for auction a short while ago, a silk black bonnet. And to me, this little story helps describe the work that we do with all of the objects in our collection. It's just a plain old black silk bonnet in a box. It came up for auction on the auctioneer's gavel stand, and he turned the lid so that we could all see it. And on top of that lid, it says, handwritten in historic ink, Grandmother Wigton's bonnet, 1859. Well, that's sort of interesting. First, we had a box with a bonnet, and now we have the name and perhaps a relationship, grandmother, to identify a person with that object, and a date, 1859. Just think how long ago that bonnet was probably put in this box and then the label was applied. Under the bonnet, when the auctioneer pulled it out of the box, was a 4x6 index card. This is a photograph of one side of it. And it says that this is the bonnet of Margaret Hines Wigton, Mrs. Christopher Wigton. So now we know she was married and she had a husband named Christopher and took his last name. The card goes on to say that when she came to visit her daughter, Eleanor Wigton Wallace, in 1859, so she had children, she died in Harrisburg on this visit. Well, that's sort of interesting. So we're getting a whole life story in this little 4x6 index card that was written, as you can see at the top, in 1935. When we turn the card over, the story goes on. Great-grandmother Wigton always traveled with a specially tied set of underclothes and a shroud in case she might die away from home. On this last visit, she forgot it, and the author underlines that. This tale was often told to me by my maternal grandmother Wallace, Eleanor Wigton, also by my mother, Mrs. Thomas Laird Wallace. The story here makes this artifact come alive. A simple black bonnet in a box with a label, and now a card that tells us a bit of the story. Finding parts of this story helps make this object somehow personally relevant. Maybe you have a great-grandmother Wigton, or great-grandmother Wigton, or a great-grandmother who wore a bonnet or didn't like hats at all. Or maybe you've dressed up to play a part that included a bonnet like this, or there might be some other object that you might have stored in a box with a label and a date and a card to identify it in your own family history. Artifacts may be important, but telling their stories makes them important to the listener. And we use artifacts here to tell stories and help our visitors connect the science and the history of agriculture and rural life. I'll just quickly conclude to tell you that this particular bonnet ended up in the hands of this gentleman, a dear friend of the museum, and the auctioneer settled his gavel, and his great-grandmother Wigton's nephew, this gentleman, remembers summers on the farm here in central Pennsylvania, just up the road from our museum site. So he is now the caretaker of this very important object. We do these kinds of interpretations with our objects all the time, perhaps history focused, perhaps STEM or science focused. And today we're going to take a look at a few objects and think about how to think about those objects in our informal education setting. Cassidy, if you wouldn't mind putting up the first poll, maybe we could ask our visitors to think about museums that you might visit with your classrooms, whatever grade or age students. And if you would, after you select your favorite field trip, or which field trips you take, add to the chat some of your favorite field trips and why those particular field trips might be your favorite. We'll let this go for just another 10 seconds or so. So do pick your favorite I see some folks are interested in museums, more so historical sites, and I suppose those are interchangeable options on our poll. Not every city has a science center nearby. Schools are also located in rural areas distant from large science centers. So know that there are other opportunities for field trips. Of course, you might take folks outside. It looks like the outdoors is a favorite, or at least most often selected field trip. It's easy to get outdoors, and we encourage you to do so. And you can find history and science in those outdoors. Also, every county in the state of Pennsylvania, and I can speak from that perspective, has a historical society that is connected to the Pennsylvania State Historical Museum Commission, as in addition to any number of additional historic sites. Reach out to those potential partners to talk about field trips and how you can adapt a visit to their site to meet the curriculum standards and objectives that you want to take there with your students. Hopefully you'll find some resources here to help you have that conversation with your local museum, historical site, science centers, or to do it on your own outdoors. Let's share the results. And you can see, again, a lot of folks outdoors, but a nice even split all the way around. And I think if I hit stop sharing, I can make this poll go away. So about the Pasto Museum. We are located in the center of the Russell E. Larson Agricultural Research Center. And around us are research fields and plots that include science endeavors in agronomy, entomology, horticulture, plant pathology. We have partners here in the USDA and the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. Agriculture surrounds us, but the focus is a little different than your typical farm and producer location. We are focused on the research that will help support Pennsylvania's farmers and agricultural production in food and fiber going forward. The museum lets us take a look backwards in time to see how far we've come, how little has changed, or how much has changed from the past. And this is a planting of squash beans and pumpkins in the front of the museum when we partnered with our friends at the Arboretum at Penn State and our Master Gardener program. Master Gardeners, through your extension services, are also available to you as a resource. So when you get outside or have your school garden ready for planting, they can provide some resources and advise you on your project. They also have curriculum and would probably love to talk to you about sharing that with your students. Here at the museum, we have students, undergraduate students, who serve as interns and volunteers who are our hands and hearts. If you were to come to the museum, our volunteers and students would be the ones that would guide you through your experience and share with your students a view of different parts of our exhibits. Annually, we host student interns. Some of these interns have gone on to graduate, and one is teaching agricultural science in agricultural education in McKean County this year. And we have a cohort this summer of new interns, looking forward to an ongoing cohort of interns to help us with the work that we do here at the museum. We have historic artifacts, and our historic artifacts are for demonstration, or excuse me, are for display. For demonstration, we use what we call educational use artifacts. This apple peeler is a reproduction of a historic 1878 Reading apple peeler that allows us to put a sticky, juicy apple on it and turn the crank and see what happens, examining how it works. And what I'd like to do is share a brief video that I pre-recorded with the help of my wonderful interns to show you how we go about doing that, explaining how things work, like peeling apples with its gears and levers, helps us understand how simple machines combine into complex machines. So if you're in 3rd or 4th grade, perhaps your science curriculum includes simple machines. You don't have to come to the Pasto Agricultural Museum. There might be simple machines in your local historical society or historic site, or certainly in a science center, or even outdoors. You can talk about some of the mechanisms and machines, or at amusement parks, a simple machine discussion could be an interesting way to think about the roller coaster rides and the whirly, twirling activities that you'd find there. We use these apple peelers because they're small and compact to help us unpack some concepts that we can then turn to our larger objects in the museum, threshers and binders and mowers, and look at how those mechanisms work. Because we've started with something simple, we can then apply that process and scaffold our participants so that they can move to a more complex object. So let's take a look at an apple peeling video.
This is an apple peeling demonstration comparing an 1878 Reading 78 apple peeler and a similar vintage inline screw drive apple peeler. When we look at the two on the table in front of us, we see that there are similarities in the handles that require turning in a clockwise direction. We see a blade both here and here, and we see 3 prongs here and here that will accept the apple. There are also some differences. This instrument uses gears and a turret, and this instrument is using a screw drive to move the apple and turn it on its axis. When we load the apple for a demonstration, I like to impale it on the stem end and it's important to find an apple smaller in size, as these apple peelers are from a time when apples were typically smaller than we might find in our current grocery store. Again, peeling this so that it is in line with the direction of movement. What I also like to do is have a competition where we might have 2 apple peelers going simultaneously, but for the purposes of this demonstration, I will demonstrate 1 apple peeling at a time. Pay attention to some of the similarities and differences in terms of time and efficiency and the actual product of the work that is completed. As we do our demonstration, we might first count down so that our participants and viewers can see how long it takes to complete the chore of peeling an apple. Do make sure that this particular apple peeler is ready to go in its start position. And watch carefully as the apple is kicked off of the peeler. This apple peeler, again going clockwise, produces an apple that's not only peeled, but it's cored. Can you see that? And sliced. An apple peeling is an apple peeling.
So at the museum, we try to be very hands-on. Peeling apples is something that we can do when we are here hosting an event or a program, but we also have kits available to our teachers so that before a visit, they can have these conversations with their students, get bags and bags of apples and have the students actually peel them themselves, provided that there's appropriate adult supervision, because we are talking about a sharp blade. It's interesting to have the conversation about before these apple peelers were available in the late 1800s. How did people peel their apples? They must have when they made apple pie. And the conversation might talk about a simple paring knife and how long that takes to peel, and how we're still peeling apples with paring knives. The apple peelers that I have in that short video are available today. And it's interesting to compare the cost in addition to the efficiency and speed and the resulting work that's accomplished. The red screwdrive apple peeler is available online or through some resources like Pampered Chef has a similar one for $25 to $30. The green apple peeler is available from a historic hardware reproduction company called Lehman's in Ohio, and it retails for over $150. It will peel an apple in about 4 seconds flat if you need it that fast. But if you've got a lot of third graders willing to turn, or summer interns like we have here, we might choose for a more labor intensive piece of work that results in peeled, cored, and sliced apples. The better apple peeler really depends on what you're intending to accomplish. And that's an important discussion to have as we think about the kinds of trade-offs that our agricultural work requires. When you're considering a new piece of technology, just like when a farmer is considering purchasing a new piece of heavy equipment, they need to think about the trade-offs, the amount of work and efficiency and the resulting product or speed that work can be accomplished in, and the cost, human cost in labor, or the cost of the device itself. And so those that equation is an important conversation that happens throughout agriculture. Trade-offs like we find in these simple machines and the pulleys, where a simple piece of rope helps change the direction of pull, to a block and tackle, which requires more rope, makes it seem easier to pull by delivering the work over a period of time, over a longer length of rope. Having hands-on activities like this available to our visitors lets them experience that work and draw comparisons themselves, rather than just being told what the answer is. So we enjoy facilitating those kinds of conversations. Another activity that we like to do as we think about food and the home and the hearth and kitchens in our exhibits is churn butter. And so we will organize visits in small groups to the museum, where we can do some of these hands-on activities in multiple stations. And we draw comparisons between now and then. So hopefully you can tell this is a present day butter display in your local grocery store, where there are plenty of brands of butter and almost butter and can't believe it's not butter options, salted butter, whipped butter in your display. And many people think, well, where does butter come from? The grocery store. We like to have a conversation about where butter came from and how the process really isn't much different today. It just might be a matter of who's doing the work of making that butter available to us. In This vintage photograph that's a good 100 or more years old, you can see the perhaps eldest daughter on the left churning in a barrel churn the cream into butter, and the daughter on the right washing the finished butter in cool water to remove all of the buttermilk. And then perhaps that's mother in the center preparing the butter, weighing it and molding it so that it would be ready for barter or sale. What I'd like to do now is share another brief video that shows you how we facilitate churning cream into butter at the museum.
Some heavy whipping cream from the grocery store, any variety will do. And you need at least as much as will fill the clean jar halfway. You don't want to overfill your jar, you need some space in those jars for things to agitate. So that means that you'll use about half a pint or 1 cup of cream for every pint-sized jar. And that works just as well, about a quarter filled on the quart-sized mason jar. I have a pint. And so what I will do in my setup is pour my cream into an unmarked pitcher so that I can hide the marked container and allow that cream to sit until it is room temperature. The temperature of the cream is important because we want to be able to churn it into butter and not whip it into whipped cream. The other thing that we'll have in place are some clean jars, and I typically use purchased mason jars or ball jars. It might be tempting to use some old-fashioned canning jars, and I would advise not using historic caps as they tend to be not food safe and contain lead. And so we do not want to use that. We can instead use a new seal and ring. Our jars, we need a series of bowls, a strainer, and a bowl with some water in hand. And then for demonstration purposes, a small jar with some water and cooking oil so that when we shake that up, it will show us that different density liquids will separate. Additionally, some spoons, and we might have some butter pats available. Also on our table, you'll see education, use, reproduction equipment, as well as a historic piece and a butter mold for demonstration purposes. We don't actually have this ready to pack. We're using it to show the scale and size of a butter mold that would pack about a 1 pound portion. So the first thing that we'll do is open our jars and pour some of our liquid into our mason jar, about 8 ounces or a quarter of our quart, and seal it up. And while we're doing that, we'll ask, what is this? What did I just pour into this canning jar? And have a conversation about what is milk, what is cream, what is butterfat, and where does all of this come from? First from the cow, and historically it would have been done on a daily basis in the small home dairy, allowed to set and culture, and that would allow the cream that would have been in suspension in the liquid milk to separate from the more dense milk. So the cream would rise to the top, and that cream would have been scooped up on a perhaps weekly basis and churned into butter. And then we'll engage our visitors to help us churn this cream into butter with a few directions. So first, we'll listen to the sound that our heavy cream is making in the jar. And we'll talk about it being a glass jar and how our hands will share some of their heat to keep that cream warm. It's important as we pass the jar from person to person to use both hands and ensure that the handoff is complete. And then each person in turn will shake that jar and then pass it on to the next. As we continue to churn our cream, the sound changes ever so slightly as it's getting thicker and air is being introduced to the mixture. You almost can't hear it moving anymore. And it sounds perhaps a bit floppy, thicker. Keep churning, we're not done yet. You'll start to see the cream, the thickened cream or whipped cream separate from the jar. You're still not done yet. Keep churning. Remember, 2 hands, nice firm shaking back and forth. Pass it from person to person. And still thick, no butter yet. Listen carefully. Did it change? Keep turning just a little while longer. And what you've got is a solid lump with some very liquidy liquid. I'll then open the jar and using a strainer, pour out the liquid that we notice is a little thinner and clearer, maybe has a tinge of blue, and drop out what is our started lump of butter. I'll take that, put it into another bowl. We'll talk about what this liquid is, identifying it as buttermilk, and how it might have been consumed right away if there was no refrigeration or fed to the animals. Because it does have some nutrition in it. And then we'll work our butter because we'll notice, even just sitting there, that some more of the liquid has dropped out. And using the back of a spoon, we'll press that butter to the sides of the bowl and work out all the little hidden pockets of buttermilk. And it's very important to do so because the buttermilk is what contains the lactose, and that sugar will continue to ferment, and it can be what spoils your butter. Much like in our Betty Butter Bought Some Butter rhyme, perhaps the butter wasn't washed and worked and washed well enough. Once we've worked our butter, we'll then drop it into some water and wash it. Continuing to change the water until it runs clear. Historically, this butter would have then been packed in a butter mold and shared the imprint of its maker that would identify it perhaps for barter and trade. We do not recommend tasting the butter that we make here at the museum because we are not in a food safe environment. We give our visitors instructions to take home with them. What we do talk about is how easy this is and can be done in any household kitchen. And then the experiment can be extended by adding flavorings, which include salt. We talk about how salt would have allowed the butter to remain shelf stable for an even longer period of time. Pure butter fat, or ghee, in some cultures is shelf stable at room temperature and even pretty hot summer temperatures, and preserving the work on the farm of raising a dairy cow and milking and producing that butter would be an important part of a home economy. Some heavy.
So before we plow through and do a couple of other activities, I see that there are some chat and maybe there's some Q&A as well. Cassidy, can you just check that and help me make sure that we don't miss anyone's questions? But I'd like to have everyone just think for a moment, presented with a clean canning jar and some cream, what kinds of connections can you make to the history and science or even literature and language curriculum that you work with your students on? When we do our butter churning demonstrations, hopefully you've seen that we talk about butter fat and what that is. We use appropriate vocabulary and describing terms like density of liquids and suspension. The butter fat is in suspension in the milk product, and because it is lighter or less dense, rises to the top. We talk about a phrase like skimming the cream from the top, or definitions of words like agitating is a great conversation to have with young people who perhaps have a younger or older sibling that they might agitate. I saw in the chat that someone already does this activity with their students, and they use a marble in the jar to agitate the cream. You can see that's not necessary. In my experience, I've lost the marble and I'd be afraid that it might get swallowed by accident. So do be careful if you do add anything to your cream product to agitate it. It's just some pretty sturdy hands constantly moving or agitating that jar that makes it work. This video condensed the time a little bit, and you probably noticed I was a little out of breath at the end. So I really appreciate it when there are other people here to help do the work of churning on the farm. And that leads me to think about some of the other connections that we make with this activity. When we're churning, we talk about the roles of family members and how churning as a weekly chore might have fallen to the young people in a family. And an older sibling might have encouraged that heavy work and persistence by sharing a song, a churning song. And there are several online, and we'll be posting those on our website to share with you. But something that goes either in a round or that you can make your own verses could sound like the tune of Farmer in the Dell, like churn, 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 make the butter fat and round, and won't you buy a pound? And so a little bit of rhyming, or a tongue twister like Betty bought some butter, but the butter was bitter. And when she put it in her cake, made the batter bitter, and went out and bought some better butter. Anyway, that too will be listed on our website for you to share with your audiences, with your students, just like we share with our audiences here at the museum. Talking about the butter mold is an opportunity to talk about barter and trade and home economics and what the value of butter is. You can connect to science and math lessons when you think about what the quantity of cream yields in terms of butter and buttermilk, and how that compares to the price per pound of butter today. If you're at all a baker, particularly around the holidays, you'll notice that as more people are baking cookies, the price of butter will go up. Why is that? This would be a great activity to make those connections to what's going on around us. I'd like to have you take out of your kit of parts a few things as we think about another activity that you can bring to your students that have some really interesting connections. I have a length of embroidery floss and some buttons. And you can see that there are some buttons that might have a shank, like the green one very close to the lip of this jar. We don't want to use a button with a shank. We want to use a button that has 2 or 4 holes right in the middle, and not holes of any great size or strange shape, just nice, simple, round holes. And we need a length of string, and you can try different kinds of string, about a yard long. But you might not have a yardstick with you. So how would you know how long a yard is? When you're talking about units of measure, you can look at some of the standardizations that have been adopted over time, where I always have a yardstick with me when I measure from the tip of my nose turned away from my outstretched hand. That is just about a yard, off screen, but about a yard. So if you would like to cut a yard long piece of string and thread it through the button in one side and back the opposite side. If you have a 2-holed button, that's pretty easy to do because there's only 2 holes. If you have a 4-holed button, make sure that they're diagonally opposite from each other. As you look at the fiber in our thread, notice that there are 6 strands on this particular DMC embroidery cotton. If you used crochet thread or twine or string, you might notice different materials behave slightly differently. And that could lead you to talk about how fibers are wound. And when our visitors come to the museum, we will make rope with our visitors. In the next step, I want you to take the 2 ends of your strand that come through your button and tie it into a knot. And finally, make it work. And so you're left with, whoops, we'll just leave it here for a moment. You're left with a button centered on 2 strands of thread, and put 2 fingers through the loops on either side. And the way to make your button yo-yo work is to prime it by giving it a few turns and then gently pull the strands apart, but allow your fingers or hands to move inward so that as the button spins in one direction and tightens the twist of strands, you move inward and then pull it apart and force the button to spin in the other direction. You go on and keep looking at that, and I will, hopefully this YouTube video will launch. Oh.
From a technical spec point of view, we can match centrifuges.
Cassidy, are you hearing that video? I should have verified that.
We hear it, we can't see it.
Let me stop share and share. Oops. Who can share? Share. I will share my desktop. So pardon the mess here.
That cost all the way from $1,000 to $5,000. But this is a tool that requires no electricity, no infrastructure. You can carry them around in your pockets for a price point of 20 cents.
We call it a paperfuge. It's essentially a piece of paper, and we put in small holders for capillaries that we can fill with blood. And we have standard string, and we take 2 pieces of either PVC pipe or wooden handles, and then you just pull on it gently. As you spin, the disc is rotating back and forth. It's rotating in an oscillatory fashion. And There's a moment when the disc is stationary, and then it starts to unwind and go in the other direction as you apply a force.
With this set of principles, we're able to essentially make a centrifuge that spins all the way to 120,000 RPM and 30,000 G-forces. In the lab, we can separate and pull out malaria parasites from blood. We can separate filaria, African sleeping sickness, separate blood plasma. It is an ultra low-cost centrifuge that's built out of principles of a very old toy, the whirligig.
This is a toy that I used to play with as a kid. The puzzle was that I didn't know how fast this would spin. And so I got intrigued and I set this up on a high-speed camera. And I couldn't believe my eyes. This thing, when you hear the noise, is actually going at 10 to 15,000 RPM. To me, that seemed like what we wanted to actually make a centrifuge.
Before us, nobody had actually understood how this toy works. So we spent a significant portion of this time truly understanding the mathematical phase space for how you can convert linear motion into rotational motion. There's some beautiful mathematics hidden inside this object. There is a value in this whimsical nature of searching for solutions because it really forces us outside our own sets of constraints of what a product should actually look like.
The centrifuge is the workhorse of any laboratory, from diagnostics to biology. And if you build a very essential, a key instrument, then you open up to a whole different variety of applications.
We just got back from Madagascar. We took the tool out to the field to work with health workers, and we're starting a clinical validation trial on a larger scale to share it with the community and the healthcare service providers, get the feedback. So it's a very iterative cycle. There is of the order of 1 billion people around the world that live with absolutely no infrastructure, no roads, no electricity. So for us, the inspiration is to make the simplest possible tools that do the job well, such that you can get them distributed around the world.
Let me go back. Whoops. All right, we need to stop that. There we go, and go back to my presentation. All right, did everybody follow me? We're all right?
Yep, we're good.
Great. Well, I hope that gives you a glimpse of how a simple object telling some stories and looking at the history and science aspects of that object can lead to stories that take us into so many powerful directions. That simple whirligig in your hands here at the museum engages audiences for a really long time. And we love that we can put these couple of pieces of this piece of string and a small button in someone's hands and turn it into a useful object that they can then work together. If we were in a group setting, many of you would probably be helping each other get that whirligig to start working. We made sure that we included more than one button in your sample pack so that you could get around the table with your friends and family and try and make that work and talk about what's the science in this art object, or is there a family member that remembers using a toy like this from their youth? So I encourage you to make button yo-yos and see what kinds of connections you can make. Another area that we look at the museum is small grains. Small grains are the staff or the bread that we consume is made from the grain of wheat or barley, rye, or oats. And those small grains are have been grown since European settlers came to the United States. This image from the turn of the last century shows a couple of gentlemen harvesting that grain. And when we look at small grains, we might think about some of the history over time of hand tools that evolved as people planted and harvested grains, and then how revolutionary changes in technology affected how those grains were harvested. This McCormick Reaper reproduction is being used to harvest the grain in the field. And when we look at the historic tools that we have at the museum, we start first by looking at the grain plant and put in our participants' hands an individual stalk of grain so that they can examine the parts of the plant and look at the stem, the leaf, the seed head, perhaps estimate the number of seeds that they see, and around our quilt, then mechanically or hand thresh those individual heads of grain. And then we talk about the parts of the plant that are not in our sample, the root that's left in the ground along with a little bit of stubble when the mower came along to cut it out of the field. We thresh grain so that our visitors can think about the plant science and agricultural engineering and where those two disciplines intersect in the equipment that over time our agricultural history has considered. And so you might use a timeline to help understand how we got from Neolithic agriculture and first started cultivating our preferences for particular foods to the 1800s and the agricultural revolution. There's a lot of time in between that. And you might turn to the Ag Foundation's Ag in the Classroom timeline that goes into great detail with super resources and film clips and videos that puts in sequence many of the milestones in our food and fiber production history. When we look just at the grain and we think about the sickle and scythe before the 1780s that were used to harvest, a family would have worked about a half an acre a day, and the yield on that half acre might have been anywhere between 5 and 20 bushels. What we need to think about as time progresses is not just the tool or the implement, but also the plant that has evolved through either our intentional or through natural selection or our intentional selection and breeding and crossbreeding of those plants. By the 1840s, 3 men using a cradler or a scythe that has fingers that helps catch the cut grain and tip it aside so the shooker could tie it into bundles would harvest between 1 and 2 acres a day. So one person, instead of a whole family, is doing now twice or 4 times as much work. A thresher would then need to mechanically thresh about a bushel in 3 hours to remove the seed head from the stalk. A mechanical mower like our McCormick Deering mower increased production. In 1831 is when it was introduced. It took until about the 1850s to really have a product that was widely accepted. And by the 1860s, Cyrus McCormick was displaying his McCormick Reaper at the London World's Fair and donated to this institution, the Penn State Agricultural College, it was named at the time, a Reaper mower. We don't currently, unfortunately, have it in our collection, but we're still trying to put our finger on where it might be. But that mechanical Reaper would have been harvesting 3 or 6 times as much per day and could have managed over 50 acres in wheat. Now that our farmers could process, plant, harvest, and process more grain with these mechanical and technological improvements, they could harvest that grain in the short period that it's ripe within and keep it as a viable crop. So the amount of grain that could be harvested was increased because the time to harvest it, or the efficiency, went up. A binder by 1877 replaced the shooker that was hand tying bundles, and one man could harvest an acre an hour. So now our time scale is changing from a family and a day to an acre an hour with one man. Two men could now do what it took 5 or 6 to do in the operation. And compared to today, that our production is much higher. In fact, what I like to think about is your typical big box retailer sits on a few acres of ground, and that might have taken several days, or in the earliest hand harvest, or perhaps a day in McCormick's era. Today, that amount of ground can be harvested in minutes. And so we perhaps understand a little bit better how we can have vast expanses of monocrop cultured wheat and grains that are then rotated with other crops, perhaps corn or hay or clover, so that best practice can yield higher crop yields. Whoops. I want to conclude with just a few resources so that you can think about where you can reach out for more information. I encourage you to go to the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission website, where you'll find their Ag History Project. And there are historical timelines of crop yields over time based on the agricultural census, and other resources to help identify buildings and sites that are agriculturally significant. In your packets, you should have also received a Joy of Farm Watching, a field guide to agriculture that I encourage you to take on your next road trip and keep it in your glove box with a pen handy, so that when you find that you're driving past a silo and can identify it, write the date down. Or if you're in Chester County, where we have a predominance of mushroom farms, and you can identify what those low slung concrete buildings are, make a notation of it in your agricultural guide, in your Joy of Farm Watching. Those brochures are available through your local county extension service, and you can reach Penn State's Cooperative Extension Service at extension.psu.edu. The American Alliance of Museums Find a Museum tool will help you find local museums, historic sites, arboretum, nature centers, all in an easy to find resource that will help you locate how far away these particular kinds of museums are. And the Engine of Central Pennsylvania will help connect you to some STEM and science resources, perhaps your local library, historical society or museum, but also subject matter experts and your IU units would have connections to STEM related activities and subject matter experts. And finally, don't hesitate to reach out to me, Rita Graef, at the College of Agricultural Sciences. By email, I can be reached at rsg7@psu.edu. I'd love to hear from you if I can help facilitate a visit to our museum when we expect to be open this fall or early spring. We'd love to have you out for a visit. Cassidy, I'm gonna see what kinds of questions we might have.
Yes, does anyone have any questions? You can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box.
And I see in the chat that we had some participants that visit some specific historic sites. A shout out to Old Bedford Village. That is a special place just south central Pennsylvania with some hands-on artisans and interpretive third-person interpreters who dress in the period of Old Bedford Village as they talk about their craft. That's a great activity that you could also engage your students in, where they might take on those third-person persona based on primary source documents, journals, letters, newspaper articles, and advertisements can give you clues as to what life was like and what was important to folks as they went about their daily life, perhaps how often they churned butter or needed to do the household chores or work on the farm. I see that Beth visits a local orchard where students can pick apples and pumpkins. Hopefully, you also extend that activity with other engaging kinds of things. Peeling apples, for sure. There are other activities that are apple related, like baking an apple pie and talking about all of the ingredients in that apple pie and where they might have come from in 1840, where the ingredients for apple pie might have come from in early 1900s, and where we get apple pies today. Just open Mrs. Smith's freezer apple pie and top it in the oven, right, for about 40 minutes. That's a much different process than harvesting the apples at the right time of year, peeling them, taking the grain that we raised in our farm to the mill to grind into flour, churning our butter. You might churn butter to use in the apple pie that you bake in your classroom.
We do have a couple questions.
Oh, perfect.
So we will send out the video with the link in the resources tomorrow. But someone else also asks, what are our options for remote interaction with Pasto Museum if we cannot bring our students to visit?
Currently, we have some resources on our website. If you go to agsci.psu.edu, you will find a link to our agricultural research tour, and that provides a map view that lets you and your students link to pre-recorded videos that are featuring parts of our agricultural research efforts across this research farm and in our labs. And we are working to develop curriculum that can support your using those resources as a teacher in your classroom. That will include some video worksheets and some curriculum connections to career and fields of study if students are considering studying science, biological science or agricultural sciences as they look to apply to college or university. And we hope in the fall and certainly by the spring of 2022 to have opportunities to connect to researchers and their labs that are featured in many of these videos, so that our virtual classroom visitors could speak with those scientists and their labs about the work that they're doing in research, the questions that they're pursuing, the paths that they took as scientists, and what inspired them perhaps in their elementary, middle school, and high school careers that motivated them to pursue horticulture, entomology, forestry as they studied in college and pursued their degrees and career paths. So we're working on it, but you can find some of those resources already on our website. I will make sure, Cassidy, that I send you a link to that specifically to include in your follow-up email.
Thank you. Have We do. Sorry, I'm pressing the space bar, so it looks like I'm muted. I Diane wants us to reiterate again that this joy of farm watching, this is what it looks like in your box, is super awesome. So just pointing that out again.
And I will reach out to all of you and implore you not only to look at it and use it, but let us know how you're using it. And if you have any suggestions. That particular publication, as I said, is available through your extension service. We are currently in revisions. In fact, after we close today's meeting, I will be headed into another Zoom session to talk about the improvements that we will make not only to the printed piece, but the online and virtual resources that will support it. And so any suggestions that you have and observations, I would love to hear them. I think it will make a great tool for our teachers. And anytime we have visitors to the museum, I try to put one in everyone's hands because you should be using it in the same way that birders identify birds, or arborists and folks interested in wildflowers use a Peterson's guide to identify those particular species.
Very nice. Do we have any other questions?
I see Shelley said something about FFA chapters. You may have in your school district an FFA chapter and an ag sciences teacher. That ag science teacher may also be teaching other science or environmental science classes. Reach out to them and coordinate. They may have FFA students looking for opportunities to talk about agricultural science, and they could perhaps offer some programming to your classroom as student teachers. So try and make a connection within your own school district with your FFA chapter and your ag science teacher. And I see that Lori mentions Laurel Hill State Park has a great education coordinator that she connects with, and our state park system across Pennsylvania and certainly our surrounding states as well. For those of you who are not from Pennsylvania, look into your state parks and register for their educational programming listservs. There are some super programmers out there developing environmental science and agricultural science, and those two domains definitely intersect. Today's farmers are thinking about not only putting food on your table and producing the crops that feed one farmer feeding over 100 people, but our farmers are thinking about the environment and water systems and soil. And our environmental educators have great programming to help make those connections for you in your classroom to your curriculum. Cassidy, do you see some other questions or things I should be highlighting? I see a shout out to Envirothon. Definitely some science classrooms and an outdoor classroom. Take advantage of those within your school district, regardless of the grade that you're in. You might be able to find some surprising and productive collaborations.
I don't see anything else.
All right.
Do you have any closing remarks you would like to share?
Well, I guess just that I am passionate about agriculture and agricultural science. And I sort of was trying to think what would sort of sum up how we think about the work that we do. And maybe it's that everything can connect back to agriculture or agricultural science. So I challenge you, as you go about the rest of your day, perhaps, think about what is the agriculture and what is the agricultural science in the next task that you're doing, the next object that you pick up, or the next interaction that you have with perhaps someone in the grocery store. What is the agriculture and what are the connections, perhaps a couple of layers in, that you can then bring back to inform the work that you do as an educator.